I've got a bit of an opening statement here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that to lead into 3 specific questions on 3 chapters from Michael's work, which are going to be based on issues of complex implication and multidirectional memory, and you'll see as I get into them. But just as a starting point, I'm just going to reframe what we've been thinking of when we think about trauma in our group so far. And that is that as we've had sessions with Cassie Caruth, Steph Krapps, and in the trauma group itself, what we've been thinking of is ways in which we can reframe the theoretical frameworks that we think about in relation to trauma, and how those can speak to our everyday present or our present social, cultural, and political realities. But what we've also been thinking of is how we can move forward from this, right? So how these ideas that we take can be taken beyond the text and can be applied essentially in practical terms that can help us challenge and rebuild. Okay, so for us to be part of challenging and rebuilding the social and political structures through which trauma is formed and manifested. And Michael, this for me is where your work becomes key, because on one hand, as Adebayo points out, your work is seminal within the field, but also you look forward to particular possibilities, right? You look forward to particular possibilities, futures, ways forward that we can think of in moving forward beyond the theoretical paradigms that we look at, beyond the text. So looking at it in practical terms. And this is specifically within multidirectional memory and the implicated subject. And I think what you do, at least to me as a reader when I read it, is I feel like I'm at one hand a scholar, reading it as an academic, and on the other hand as an activist, kind of engaged in this process of thinking about social change, and in that sense. And in both these works, you bring community to the center, which is why my questions are going to do very focus on the idea of community. You make community central, community, trauma, and memory particularly central here. And you discuss this idea, you explore this idea of community as communities are significant in constructing trauma. They are significant in making its memory. They're significant in the way it's integrated into the everyday lives, but they also can be agents for social change. And that for me is a particularly significant aspect of your work, this focusing on this idea of communities in relation to how they can themselves can be active in social change. So just to draw on a couple of examples from your work, and this will lead into my 3 questions. I was particularly struck in multidirectional memory by your analysis of W.E.B. Du Bois' visit to the Warsaw Ghetto, which he undertook in 1949. He was going to Germany and Poland, and obviously he then wrote it in an essay which you critique in the text, which he wrote, published in Jewish Life in 1952. And so when you look at this experience, W.E.B. Du Bois' engagement with that space, with the Warsaw Ghetto, and with the way in which it illuminated for him a different experience of the race problem, seeing that the race problem itself is not an isolated issue, and that in actual fact, it can be in dialogue, in universal dialogue with issues of racism and hate beyond the kind of color line. And you look at this from 2 perspectives. On the one hand, as a scholar, you look at it in relation to how it can contribute to the fields of trauma theory, but also post-colonial studies, African-American studies, and also Holocaust studies. But on the other hand, what you also do is you also look at it in relation to the community itself, how communities that exist outside the text can make memory. Okay, or rather can in themselves apply this method that you apply, this idea of multidirectionality, and apply it within their own communities, their own form of ways of thinking about relationships between their memory and other communal memories and dialogue. And very crucially on that note, you suggest that in order to make those connections, those memories, both within that space of the Bois text and without it, one needs to not think in terms of comparisons, and one needs to not think of continuities and discontinuities between histories, but rather ways in which we can seek out solidarity and lines, okay, between our particular histories, so particular points of intersection. And those particular points of intersection then become particularly integral when you talk about solidarity and alliance, become particularly integral to your reading of in the implicated subject. the figure that exists between the victim and perpetrator. And just from a personal angle, obviously I, like you, white Jewish, can definitely relate to that kind of position, particularly in our context, where it's 27 years after democracy. The social and economic inequalities, they still exist in our country. And there's definitely a need now to kind of rethink this notion of what it means to be implicated, okay, in terms of our own position, in terms of having particular racial privilege, gender privilege, economic privilege. And this is why that work was so important to me, both from a personal perspective and an academic perspective. And I was particularly struck, and this is where I'm going to bring in my questions, and also thinking about these ideas of possibilities, because the idea of possibility in your work is so significant, possibility, future. And so I was particularly struck by two particular chapters in the implicated subject, and this will, as I said, will lead to the questions. The first one is your introductory chapter, where you introduce the notion of the implicated subject by looking at Trayvon Martin, the murder of Trayvon Martin by George Zimmerman, and the way in which implicated subjects responded to that murder. And that is where you introduce that notion, that process of identification. And as you argue, and with caution, and emphasizing this idea of empathy, okay, emphasizing the idea of empathy, but finding empathy in such a way that one doesn't necessarily identify with the victim entirely, because that, in a sense, takes away from the victim's own narrative. And also not identifying with the perpetrator, rather finding a kind of boundary balance where one understands and engages with the fact that they, in fact, exist between, and in fact, an implicated subject understands that he or she exists between these boundaries of victim and perpetrator, and in fact is responsible for making them. And by acknowledging that, then one can, as you say, begin to move into a feeling of empathy, or begin to establish some form of empathy. And then building on from that, you complicate things a bit further. And this is where I'm going to bring in the questions with complex implication. Because ultimately, with complex implication is where you bring in this idea that the implicated subject might not necessarily just be by virtue of just implicated. They might in themselves have a connection to a history, or social or cultural history of victimization or perpetration. And this kind of confuses the boundaries between them. And to look at that, you bring in that experience of the Jewish South African in response to apartheid and post-apartheid South Africa. And then you also bring in that experience of Judaism in relation, or Jews in relation to Israel and Palestine, and arguing against and talking about how, on one hand, Jews have an affinity to the victim's identity in relation to Holocaust memory, on one hand, but on the other hand, they are still implicated in the context of apartheid, in the death of, or rather the perpetration against Black South Africans, and the context of Gaza in the perpetration against Palestinians. And so with this in mind, okay, and now what I also want to just point out here, that again here you don't provide us with easy solutions for this. You suggest ultimately we need to find points of solidarity and alliance as a starting point, which I agree with. And what I found particularly profound about your work is that you suggest this, and you suggest we need to look at possibilities, right? And look at possibilities beyond the text, which you imply in implicated subject. We need to rethink beyond the text how we can look at this in practical terms. And so thank you for that. And so now I just want to lead into the specific questions. I'm going to try and make them abridged or shorten them as much as possible. But the first is going to link to the idea that you put in your chapter on where you look at William Kentridge's drawings for projection, and where you introduce this idea of complex implication, this idea of the implicated subject in relation to their history, and also in relation to the notion of the perpetrator. So in this case, I was just interested, as you were writing this, I kept thinking of what would be the place of this. You talk about the Jewish implicated subject in the South African context, but I was thinking, what would be the place of the Jewish South African activist in this context? Because Jewish South African activists, particularly during apartheid, had a very different experience from your Jew that was outside of that space. Because what happened in that particular space was that if one was and activists, used many of them, like Joe Slovo, Rusty Bernstein, Harold Walpe. They didn't associate with their Judaism, first of all. They didn't associate with their Judaism. And then they were essentially ostracized from their own community by virtue of the fact that they were participating in apartheid activities. And by the same token, the association with white liberalism was itself problematic, because as Steve Biko points out, they were still, in I Write What I Like, they were still associated ultimately with issues of privilege, right? And also was essentially bringing in and emphasizing this idea, a particular idea of what Black freedom should be, okay, and what the way forward should be, right? And so keeping those ideas in mind, keeping this very complicated idea of this Jewish activist figure in mind, I'll ask you to use the terms and ideas that you look at in relation to Trayvon Martin, and also the kind of ideas you look at in this particular chapter, okay? Looking particularly at the different way in which othering is positioned here, the implicated subject is positioned here, but also thinking of this in terms of how this can reconfigure the way we look at the figure of the Jew within trauma theory itself. Okay, so how can it complicate then, in that sense, our understandings of national identity, Jewishness, community, and othering within the context of trauma studies? Okay, that's the first one. The second one is going to then lead into Gaza, for your chapter on Gaza, Warsaw. And in this case, I'm going to ask you, I was struck when I was reading it. I kept thinking about, we look at through the lens of Holocaust memory and Gaza within that chapter. But thinking about the link between the two chapters, what was interesting to me is when I thought about in relation to apartheid memory, because in our context, we look at the Israel-Palestine conflict through the lens of apartheid memory. And thinking of it through those terms, what I want to ask ultimately is, when we think through that lens, right? We think of the Israel politics, as I said, through apartheid memory. And this lens tends to reinterpret the conflict by situating it in relation to race, as opposed to specific religious and cultural identities. And now thinking through the lens of multidirectional memory, what does that suggest about apartheid, how apartheid memory has been understood in the context of memory and trauma studies, number one? So how has apartheid been understood in that case? And what are the consequences and implications of looking at the conflict within the framework outside of Holocaust memory? And then finally, and this is just going to bring it back to the idea of possibility in your work and optimism, which actually I found to be the most poignant and most significant aspect of your work. And that is that trauma studies is usually considered to be a field of study that usually presents a very difficult and bleak perspective on human nature. Okay, and it represents us in our most negative aspect. But your work seems to suggest that there's a place for optimism in trauma studies. And so what I want to ask is, why is exploring the possibility of hope and optimism significant to the study of trauma?